So we're going to look at Wundt and the emergence of psychology as a science. This is how this is phrased in the syllabus. So it's not enough just to know about Wundt, but you want to tie it to how psychology as a discipline developed as a science, and your AO3 will be the extent to which we can consider psychology a science, including Wundt. So here are the key points to know about Wundt if you still didn't know them. He opened the first psychology lab in 1879 in Leipzig. That's why we consider Wundt the father of experimental psychology. He was the first to establish psychology as a discipline in its own right. His branch of psychology was called structuralism, and the idea was to organize the mind into its basic structures. So it's an example of a reductionist approach, and that's in line with the scientific credibility of a discipline. His method of study was introspection. Important aspects of introspection was that the participants were trained, and they were trained to look inside. That's what introspection means, but in an objective way. So Wundt prioritized objectivity as well in his method. And then he had a standardized procedure and standardized apparatus with standardized stimuli, such as a metronome ticking at regular intervals, and this was presented to participants, and they were asked, as I said, to report objectively about their thoughts, images, and sensations that they could see happening in their mind. So not their emotions or their opinions. It was an objective report. Now, from this, you can develop Wundt's influence on psychology as a science. For example, inspiring cognitive aspects of studying the mind, first of all. Only because of Wundt, there was then an inspiration of studying the mind in its own right that re-emerges with the cognitive revolution in the 1970s. And they were studying conscious experiences, and they were studying the mind in the lab. And that was in line with Wundt's principles. Another approach that is inspired by Wundt is the behaviorist approach, because they also studied psychology and psychological phenomena in a lab, for example, Skinner and Watson, and they also focused on objectivity. They brought it one step forward. So compared to Wundt, not only they wanted objectivity, but they also rejected the possibility of studying the mind in its own right, but only studying behavior, because that was more objectively observable compared to a person's self-report of their thoughts. So already here we see a little bit of a schism, a little bit of a change in the scientific credibility of psychology, and your valuation will be based on this. If we look at the history of psychology and we look at the principles of science, there are some approaches that are more or less in line with the key features of science. Now, these are the features of science. You do need to know all 7 of these. They're all named on the syllabus in the research methods section, meaning that they can appear anywhere. And these are theory construction, the ability from research to build a general law that relates to everyone, and therefore that occurs over and over in the same way. Like, for example, in other sciences, it could be gravity. The theory of gravity, nothing doesn't follow that principle, so it's a universal general law. Hypothesis testing is making a prediction that then you will test to verify whether your theory is valid or not. As you can see, these points, these features all tie in with each other. For example, replicability later on ties in with hypothesis testing. Only if my research is replicable can I then go on to test the hypothesis again and again in order to verify and therefore construct my theory. In order to do all this, we go back to the third point. I need to use an empirical method. That means that I can use only evidence that can be tested through the senses. For example, it can be seen, it can be heard, it can be touched, not therefore emotions and thoughts that are not empirical data. Now, paradigm shift is one of the biggest features here in the history of psychology, because the paradigm is a set of beliefs that everybody buys into in a specific discipline. It's how we study things and what we believe are the kind of core principles and idea underlying our study matter. And this is something that is a big question in terms of psychology, and it will be your conclusion to this essay. We've already touched on replicability, the ability to repeat a study, so it's to do with standardized procedures and methods. Objectivity is the lack of bias, so obviously all those um, empirical methods allow objectivity because everybody can see, for example, in behaviorism, a behavior occurring, there's no interpretation there. And falsifiability is the ability to prove something wrong, to disprove something through hypothesis testing. So what we go on to falsify would be the null hypothesis, that there's no significant difference. That's something that, for example, in the psychodynamic approach is not possible because according to the psychodynamic approach, one outcome and the opposite of that outcome could both support the underlying theory. For example, Freud might say an anal fixation could result in someone being really, really tidy and having OCD symptoms, but also the opposite of being really, really messy. He calls the messy version anal expulsive and the tidy version anal retentive, but meaning that both these completely opposite outcomes could support his idea of anal fixation, meaning that it's an unfalsifiable theory. So as you can see, you can touch on the history of psychology because the question is asking you about the emergence of psychology as a science. And kind of, if you look at the history, psychology emerges as a science with Wundt, then it remains scientific with the behaviorist approach. Yeah, here we've got Pavlov, and we've got Skinner here, and we've got Watson. But then we've also got some unscientific theories. For example, as I said, Freud, highly unscientific, and then later on, the humanistic approach. On the other hand, even later, we've got the cognitive approach, and here it's not on the history, but you know, after that, cognitive neuroscience, that is scientific excellence. But as you can see, it's not a straight line. We go in and out of scientific credibility throughout the history of psychology. So you see, your AO3 will be the emergence of psychology as a science can be questioned because there are arguments for and against psychology being a science. For example, one of the big challenges for psychology is the lack of objectivity. As I mentioned, you can talk about Freud's interpretation of dreams. You can also talk about the issue of culture bias. For example, in attachment research, you know about the imposed ethic in the strange situation, for example, and also in, for example, in definitions for abnormality, deviation from social norms. But we know that this is a major problem throughout the psychology. So you can give other examples if you want. You don't need 10 examples. You've made your point once you've made a couple. So you move on to the counter argument that is saying, on the other hand, there are approaches that have maintained that objectivity throughout psychology. For example, we've got the examples of Skinner boxes, but also the use of brain scanning by Talvin in memory, both short and long-term memory research is supported by empirical evidence from brain scanning techniques. And then you can move on to the next AO3, that is the lack of a shared paradigm. As I said, the humanistic approaches looked at psychology from a completely different point of view. Freud lacked scientific credibility, but he did believe in the idea that psychology should be a science, whereas Rogers and Maslow didn't believe in that because they advocated for an idiographic method, for focus on free will. They argued that we're all unique and therefore it was impossible to construct a theory based on individual differences and free will. And for that reason, we have a big criticism, and it might be worth remembering this name. Kuhn has argued that psychology is a pseudoscience, it's not a real science, because of the lack of a shared paradigm. And to finish up, you can talk about the big implications for psychology. Psychology not having a clear scientific status and lacking that consistency and scientific credibility has implications for funding. Lots of funding might go to other sciences compared to psychology because of that inconsistency. There's also a specific issue in psychological research that is called the replicability crisis, that the majority of studies have a 50-50 chance of producing the same result when repeated, making us even more question whether not so only should psychology be a science, but as a discipline, has it got the ability to be a science? And that should wrap up your essay nicely.